he was calling me lots of horrible names. And, I turned round to him and I said, if you really think that I'm all those things, why don't you just let me go? Why would you not just want to be shot of me? And he said, if you don't leave me, you're not those things.
Oh, crikey. Hello, and welcome to our Human Givens podcast. I'm Julia Wellstead, and I'm part of the HG team. Now, to help raise awareness of domestic abuse during this Mental Health Awareness Week in 2019, today we're discussing whether and indeed how we can recover from psychological domestic abuse. And because of this, our format today is a little bit different, as I actually have two people with me. Hannah Jackson, a Human Givens psychotherapist, and one of Hannah's clients, Emma, who's kindly agreed to tell us about her own experience of being subjected to prolonged psychological domestic abuse. Hello to both of you, and thank you so very much for agreeing to share your story and experience with us. Now, Hannah, perhaps you could begin by explaining what we mean by psychological domestic abuse.
Of course, yes. So psychological abuse is often known as something called coercive control. And coercive control or controlling behaviour became an offence in December 2015. And the Home Office defines it as a behaviour which does not relate to a single incident, but it's a purposeful pattern of incidents that occur over time in order for one individual to exert power, control or coercion over another. And by the end of March 2018, it was reported that an estimated 2 million adults aged between the ages of 16 to 59 experienced domestic abuse in that year. And that was 1.3 million women and around 695,000 men.
My goodness, that's astonishing figures, isn't it? And in a sense, giving a name to psychological domestic abuse has maybe given people a voice to stand up and say, this is something I'm suffering.
So that was a 23% increase from the previous year of reporting. And I think this really reflects the fact that the police have improved their identification, recording of abuse incidents as crimes, and also an increased willingness of victims to come forward.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Hannah, let's drill into this a little bit in terms of what are the tools of abuse and why is it so hard to break away from that abuse, from the abuser?
I think I've identified three things to talk about tonight. One of the tools I think is an element of uncertainty, and I don't think that this is just a result of psychological abuse, but it's also used as a tool to keep the victim in a permanent state of indecision, so that they're unable to take action.
Yes.
And I think this can be a very subtle way of removing someone's sense of autonomy and control, which is one of our essential human needs.
Yes.
I think there's also a term known as gaslighting. And
explain that.
Well, this is a form of coercive control which was coined actually from a 1940s film called Gaslight, where in that film a man convinces his wife that she's losing her mind by slowly manipulating her to believe that this is the case. And it's it's a form of coercive control that's very subtle. It makes the victim question their reality and question their sanity. And it's done gradually over time. So even the most self-aware people can be hoodwinked. And the victim doesn't know that someone's doing it, and they may not realise for years. So in that way, one may become dependent on the abuser.
Ah, yes.
And then I think the third thing that I wanted to talk about was something called intermittent reinforcement, which it's not simply a case of lack of resources and fear that can hold the victims back, but the psychological dependence that they develop on their abuser. So the victim might be rewarded with inconsistent and occasional attention and then punished with fear of losing the relationship.
Right. Yes. So it's intermittent. So it's not reliably one or the other.
Exactly. So you don't
Yeah.
know where you are. You're pulled in one way and then in another direction,
Yeah.
and you're never sure.
Gosh, that's 3 pretty hard-hitting effects, isn't it? Yes, or tools. And sorry, so what are the effects of psychological abuse then, given those tools?
Well, I think Emma might be able to
Yeah.
speak up here about the effects.
I started to realize that I had become very anxious. I noticed that I was suffering from very, very bad insomnia. And I mean, I'd had a couple of kids by then, but it wasn't, the children.
It wasn't that sort of insomnia.
It wasn't that. It was, really, I would lie awake, absolutely bolt awake. And I would start to have these sorts of anxiety attacks. I'd become depressed and withdrawn. I would wake up in the morning and basically start crying before I'd even got out of bed. And I started having these sorts of invasive thoughts about, I wasn't suicidal or self-harming, but I would have these what were like invasive thoughts of me doing things to myself, but I didn't want to do it. But it was very scary. Yes. And I sort of look back now, and I think I was living in a kind of mental torment. That's how I would describe it. But my partner at the time was my wonderful partner, just so lovely, really.
Right. So you didn't attach this to him at all?
No, he was so patient with all my, in inverted commas, problems. I was very lucky to have someone like him to be so patient with me, given that I had all these problems. And to have someone so caring to be my partner.
And was that the perception of your friends and family as well? That
yeah, I think it was when I started to realize things were when I started to realize and confided in a couple of people. People said to me, "Oh, you know what? I thought something was funny when he said X, Y, Z that time, or that struck me as a bit odd when this happened." But this all only came out in retrospect.
Yeah. As is so often the case with relationships, friends and family might notice something or might think in hindsight something, but they don't say anything at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone through, my mum used to come and visit me, and she would go home, she told me afterwards, she would go home and cry, because she'd say, like, I don't know where my daughter's gone. I was unrecognisable, I dressed completely differently. Before I'd been quite a sort of vivacious person, and I just become this withdrawn, I would dress in dark,
yes.
I just sort of totally disappeared. I just disappeared.
Yes. It's almost the sackcloth sort of type of dressing, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and so my mum said it was really weird because your house didn't reflect any of your sort of personality or style. Like, it was just like you'd just gone. And she used to go home and cry. But she knew, the thing is, I was I was open with people that I was suffering with, this sort of strange depression and anxiety. I wasn't like clinically depressed, but obviously I was very low. And so they sort of said that, but because there's not that awareness of psychological abuse, nobody really was able to put the pieces together any more than I was.
Yeah. And at what point was there a point where you just realized that it was coming from your partner?
That was it was a process. So, and I think because I sort of as part of coming out of this, I've talked to other survivors with similar experiences online and compared experiences, and I think this is quite common, is that you have these sorts of penny drop moments where you're like, but that doesn't make sense. Like, why is that happening? And what? And I sort of, because sometimes I make jokes about it, like if it's like Columbo when he says there's something that's bothering me.
Yes.
There's this little thing that's bothering me.
Yes.
And I think you start to have these moments, but then because he wasn't working, and we were struggling with just with what I was doing, I was offered a job opportunity. I wasn't looking for it, but somebody asked me to take on a maternity cover job, and it was, you know, full time. So we had, you know, a guaranteed income for the first time in a while. I couldn't not take it. Yeah. And I think a combination of being away from him for those 8 hours a day, and starting to have other social interactions in my day, and also the quality of those interactions was that, you know, if I had a question, it would get answered. If I had an opinion, somebody might listen to it.
Yes. And was he unhappy that you were going out to work, or?
So he seemed in the beginning just sort of like, you do what makes you happy, but he would do things like, you know, at 6 o'clock when the day ended, he would call me at 6 o'clock on the dot and ask me if I was coming home. Right. He would always do that in quite an insistent way. And at the time I was just like, oh, he's probably bored and he's just wanting to know when I'm coming home. Yes. But of course, in retrospect, it's not really usual for somebody to call you at 5:57 every day and say, are you on your way? Yeah. But
I think we rationalize everything at the time, don't we? Before we've sort of.
That's right. He just misses me. You know, he just misses me. He's bored. And I think that I started to notice that how unequal our relationship was in terms of the effort being put in, and I started to notice the emotional neglect because I just had things to compare it with in terms of, as I say, people just treating me. He wasn't overtly aggressive, wasn't overtly sort of mean at that point, but I think he was quite neglectful, and he could just shut you down or turn you out or sort of switch off to you. Yes. And I think just being in an environment around people just acting normally
made you realise that.
Yeah, well, it started just very physically. Like I'd cry on the way home, and I wasn't sure why. And going to work sort of brought on a kind of crisis of my anxiety about a month after I started, and I was referred to CBT on the NHS, and she got me to keep a diary with when I felt energized and happy and when I didn't. And that was an eye-opener, because I realized that there were times either at work or when I was with the children by themselves that my out of 10 I would go up to an 8 in well-being, but really specifically the times where I was sort of 1 or 2 or even 0 were when I was with him. And I started to notice that when he came in the room, within 20 minutes I would either start crying, like I would just start weeping, so just weeping into my breakfast, or I would feel like I would have to go and have a lie down. And and then I started to realize that our relationship didn't have any sort of intimacy or friendship. It was really based on that I would have these collapses of anxiety, and at that point he would be quite nice to me and be like, oh, you poor fragile thing. Yes. And so I sort of was like, I realized that the kind of dynamic of our entire relationship was based around me being this kind of weak, sort of crumbled down person, and him being nice to me. But then at other times he would kind of ignore me or shut me down in a very subtle way. And he, you know, things around the house or things around with the kids, it was like he didn't care about them. And I thought maybe he's depressed, do you know what I mean? Things like that. So I realized something wasn't right, but I couldn't realize what it was. But then as soon as I started to try and confront the problem, get him to talk about it, try and get him to go for therapy or counselling, you know, I ended up in the spare room because I did start to not feel safe. So when I sort of started to not feel safe around him, I think maybe because I didn't understand his behaviour.
Do you mean physically, not physically safe?
Yeah, I remember when we still shared a bedroom, I remember waking up in the morning and just being able to identify one morning that I just didn't feel safe with him there. I mean, I couldn't understand why. I just had a feeling of physical unsafety.
Yes.
And so I sort of realised that I couldn't sleep in the same room as him anymore. I felt unsafe. And then the more I started to pull away, then behaviour started to come up, which I was like, this is weird. This is like an abusive person, because then the sort of verbal abuse, you know, the more overt emotional abuse and other types of escalations, threatening, lots, different other things. And so, I turned to Google to is this abuse? And then I learned that, this behavior doesn't come out of nowhere, and that it's possible that you can have a more insidious form of abuse that is sometimes called, either called psychological abuse or covert abuse or hidden abuse.
Yes.
And that, and that I realized that what I'd been going through for the past few years, the symptoms I'd had were exactly what it was describing. And
So did that feel like quite a light bulb moment? This was you looking at Google. You at this stage hadn't spoken to anyone about it.
No, I was looking at, sort of health websites and relationship websites. And I realized that had pretty much been in a textbook abusive relationship. It just hadn't taken the form up till then of the more aggressive, overt type that people tend to understand, like they would recognize more.
Yes.
But I realized that the patterns of how he would shut me down, how he would disapprove, like very quietly and subtly disapprove of things that I was doing, how he could be quite scary because his silent treatments were quite scary, but I just felt like I'd done something wrong. So I wasn't like, why is he acting like a scary person? I was like, gosh, I've done something awful.
You always assumed it was you, which of course is part of the pattern.
Exactly. So I think it took a process of a few months for me to really go, something's wrong. These things are wrong. It's probably not me. It's definitely something to do with something he's doing. And then pulling away, and then he switched up to more overt things. And then I was like, this is actually an abusive relationship. I've actually been in an abusive relationship the whole time.
Yeah. And if we can bring Hannah in here, at what point, Emma, did you seek out help with or find Hannah?
So I did seek out, as soon as I was really identifying the abuse, I sought out a therapist who wasn't Hannah. It was somebody sort of closer to where I live. But then I had to I found Hannah because I did make an escape attempt, which didn't work. And then I needed to find somebody to help me deal with that, because I really crashed out at that point.
Because you had to go back to the home.
I tried to leave, and the court basically sent us back, which is a whole other story.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So and then I really, I wasn't able to function for several weeks after that, not surprisingly. And I found Hannah through a sort of friend of a friend, and I knew that she had experience dealing, working particularly with trauma. And I felt like, her sort of mix of approaches was something that could help me in, my situation that was really extraordinary, where by this time I'd completely identified abuse. I knew that I was living with somebody very scary, but at the same time I was in no way able to leave that situation, and I wasn't sure at what point I would be able to leave that situation.
Yeah. And if we can bring you in, Hannah, from your point of view, what was the person like who you met when the two of you got together?
I think the first thing that when Emma's friend called me, and I heard Emma in the background saying, but please don't tell me that I need to leave and go to a refuge, because I can't do that. I thought, gosh, this is a very serious situation, and how are we going to be able to deal with that if you're still in that abusive situation? So we worked, I think, Emma, for a long time about really being able to be in control of what you could be in control of, and being aware that you did still have a level of control, albeit that might be internally, or your thoughts, or just being able to lock a door, or have some time. I think what was very shocking to me, I think, at first was that Emma didn't have any real privacy, not even in the bathroom, and so we worked on regaining that control of having that little bit of privacy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it was. I think I'd realised by that point that, I mean, effectively, I wouldn't be able to leave until a series of court hearings had been completed, and that process is slow and unpredictable.
It's a long time.
Long, yeah.
And when you said felt you couldn't leave, what can you drill into that a bit? Was that because you didn't have the confidence to leave?
No, it was the court. You see, effectively, because I was unable to categorically prove the abuse because of the insidious nature of it, especially because I'd only identified it after I'd decided to divorce and we'd sort of, technically split up.
Yes.
I was told that there was no way the court would sort of support me in that, and that I would be seen as manipulating the situation to get custody of the children. So I had been told earlier, and as soon as I filed for divorce, and he became abusive, I asked my solicitor and I said, I think he's abusive, I think we need to get out. And he said, I advise you not to do that because the court will take this view and you could lose the children, because he'd been unemployed and at home. He was saying that he was the chief carer. He was the child carer and the house husband. I had to go out to work for that reason, and so I was told, like, if you leave without the children, you've abandoned them, and if you leave with the children, you've taken them without his. And so I left. I tried to leave in. I tried to leave in April 2017 because at that point I'd found my way to this is before meeting Hannah. I'd found my way to victim support, who were brilliant, and they'd done a risk assessment. So I'd been to social services, I'd been to different people, and nobody had done a risk assessment or anything. They just said, well, it's all just sounds like it's your word against his. Victim support did a risk assessment, and I came out as high risk and was referred to MARAC, which is a multi-agency risk assessment conference where the different agencies in the borough, sort of police, health, and social services, they all get together and discuss high-risk people in the community and work out a plan. So I was referred to MARAC, and when I was referred to MARAC and read what that was, that I was a high-risk person, I thought, well, I can't in good conscience as a mother stay here with my children, because before I was obviously really worried. I would not sleep at night thinking, am I doing the right thing? Because I don't want to lose my children and they have to go and live in that environment forever, and I don't have my children. But at the same time, if we're all at risk, because a lot of his behaviour became very menacing and scary, and I really didn't know what he was capable of. I was absolutely terrified. Gosh. I was like, am I putting us all at risk by just being here? And that's not a choice that anyone should have to make.
You're in a complete double bind there, aren't you? The people you were contacting, was he aware of that?
No, so he wasn't aware of victim support. Before I tried to leave, he knew that I was going to see a therapist. I mean, he would try and sort of use that against me. So, he told the social workers that I didn't care about the children because instead of spending my evenings with them, I was going to therapy and stuff like that. So it was
a no-win situation. Goodness.
So I mean, everything was all like that. So it was very difficult.
Just to perhaps get back to Hannah, and so you met Emma in this stage where she felt she couldn't, for quite practical sounding reasons, leave the home.
Yes.
How were you able to help at that stage?
So I think Emma was having to be very alert all the time at home. And there was a lot of tension and anxiety all of the time in the home. And so I think we worked a lot on deep relaxation at first, breath control. I think you said that 7-11 breathing really, really helped.
Yeah, I use that a lot. I use that a lot.
So we did a lot of deep relaxation. And then we also, we did something which we called joy shots, so that Emma would choose a shot of joy every day. So whether that was having a lovely song that she would listen to, or she'd go for a drive, or she'd do some sort of exercise, or she'd have a lovely coffee. So she would just give herself that injection every day. of joy. We did morning pages, so Emma would write, sort of stream of consciousness every morning, just to get the feelings out, and possible frustration and anger. And then also we worked on using the anger as an energy, the anger and the frustration, to really fuel her power, and so she could stand firm and refuse to be unhappy. So we have this phrase, refuse to be unhappy, and be in control of things that she could be in control of, however small that was.
Because the other thing that is just occurring to me in the most awful way, as children with abusive parents learn how to be, so that they escape the abuse as much as possible.
Yes.
Emma, did you sort of learn coping mechanisms like that?
I think the thing is that by the time he'd become overt, he knew that I was leaving him, and
he knew the game was up. Yes.
And I wasn't. I did consider not leaving him, even like after I realised he was awful. And I was terrified. I did think to myself, well, it's only 13 years until the kids are grown up, and if the kids are going to have to go and live with him, I'd rather live like this for like 13 years, even though I barely know how I would survive it, and I might not even survive it. But I was like, maybe I wouldn't have to do that.
Yes.
But deep down, of course, I realised that wasn't possible. I wouldn't have survived it. And so I think what I realised at that point was that I because I'd identified abuse and started to educate myself, I of course knew that there was nothing that I could do one way or the other for anything to stop the way he behaved.
Make it better. Yes.
I mean, I did once. He was calling me lots of horrible names, and I turned round to him and I said, if you really think that I'm all those things, why don't you just let me go? Why would you not just want to be shot of me? And he said, if you don't leave me, you're not those things.
Oh, crikey.
So I realised that I wasn't dealing with anything resembling any form of logic that I could
rationale there
could deal with.
So presumably at some point, obviously, you did get out. How did that happen?
I had to wait for the court hearings to roll around.
Gosh.
So just to after I was referred to the Marrick and I realised we were all high risk, I tried to leave, but then I had to defend that in court, and I tried to get a protective order. But he had also then claimed that he was abused. I was abusing him, because that's the manipulative side.
Yep.
And the judge just said, oh, it's very complicated. I haven't got time to hear this today. It was supposed to be a short hearing. You'll just have to go back until we can sort it out.
How long was that?
So then I was then there for another 6 months. Until all the hearings had rolled around. And then by the time it got to the children's matter hearing, I was told, do not bring up abuse again, do not, because the social workers didn't know how to identify psychological abuse either. And they'd sort of gone, oh, well, they don't get on very well. And so I was told not, if I sort of pressed that I would almost certainly be seen as the troublemaker, and it might affect the kids. So it's the standard divorce court sort of 50-50 childcare. And then once that was decided, I could leave because that was done. And so I could leave, but I had to carry on paying for his accommodation and bills, because I had to, because that was the only way I could leave. So then I got it. So that's obviously like financial abuse. But I think, the thing about all these methods of abuse is that I think it's very rare for someone to just use one tool of abuse. So if you have
use everything available,
you're probably having financial abuse at the same time.
Yes.
So leaving was this very gradual thing.
And meanwhile, you were still seeing Hannah.
Yes.
regularly.
All the way through this, wasn't it? It was every week, I think, wasn't it, at that time?
Yes, when it was very intense, I was coming every single week to see Hannah, and it was a lifeline. It was an absolute lifeline, because, as I was saying, it was like a siege. You know, I saw it very much as like a siege type situation where, you know, there was this kind of, could I last it out? It wasn't going to last forever, but I didn't know how long, and I knew that his aim was to wear me down. So at one point, I can't remember when I realised it, but I realised that although he was very scary and menacing, I realised that he wanted me to crumble. He would he told a lot of people, he told social workers and a lot of people in their circle that I was suicidal and that I was going to kill myself. And I wasn't suicidal, but the fact that he kept telling people that made me think that he wanted me to crumble. And so I was like, I just have to last. I just have to sustain myself emotionally and psychologically in order to be able to last and for it not to overwhelm me. And
by this stage, your friends and family were in the know, were they, or not entirely? By the sound of it, they sort of had his side of things.
One friend, he approached one friend when I started uncovering abuse, and she sort of didn't believe it. But I think his behaviour then, he kind of let him, you know, he started to lose control. So I think there was one point where she was trying to mediate between us, and he started sort of using slurs to describe me and things. And she was just like, well, this isn't, I can't talk to you if you're going to be like that. But I think I was very lucky. Another thing that a lot of, survivors of psychological abuse don't have, in that I think a lot of them also had the penny drop moments when I described what was going on, that I said, you know, in retrospect, they were like, oh, well, actually, yes, that makes sense, because we'd all, you know, they'd had a gut feeling. They sort of noticed things but couldn't quite put a name to them. And I think the people, I was lucky that the people who were close to me did support me.
And I'm assuming there was a wonderful moment when you left, but perhaps you didn't immediately feel better, or did you? How did that go, and how did the continuing therapy help?
Well, I sort of couldn't believe it when I was finally able to, you know, shut the front door of my house behind me. It was obviously bittersweet, because I wasn't living in the same place as my children half the time. That, you know, so that was something I had to deal with. But I think so your children were still with him at this stage? Half and half. Right. So so there was that. So yeah, I was seeing Hannah, and I think it was then that I started to feel a few weeks after that I could deal with some specific trauma work, because you know, Hannah, you know, we talked about the fact that while I was still there, although I was dealing with a lot of trauma, that starting to deal with that while I was still encountering it was not the best. It was very difficult, yes. Whereas once it was historical, even if it was only by a day, then it was much easier to deal with. And Hannah, how did, from your side of things, how did the therapeutic process change once Emma had moved out?
Then we did start to do, as Emma says, some trauma recovery. I think even before that, though, Emma was, once Emma knew about her inner needs and what she needed, and started to meet those in a more healthy way, because, you know, she was in control now, that was the start of weakening that toxic environment.
Yes, so psychoeducation of our needs and resources,
absolutely,
that sort of human givens framework,
absolutely, and building and maintaining resilience and taking the actions necessary to be safe and secure as far as was possible. But then when Emma did leave, we have done probably about 3 or 4 sessions now on trauma recovery, and it's not been easy, has it? It's been I think you know, sometimes we store trauma in the body, and I think that's been the case for Emma. So I noticed when we do those trauma recovery sessions, they're very visceral, they're very physical experiences, and not easy, but I think they have lifted things, and the heaviness has gone from some of those events that we've
And I think it's, you know, that's one thing that I had to learn, is that although the abuse was primarily psychological, that it has, you know, dealing with it is quite physical, in terms of, like, for example, I until a certain point I used to enjoy going running, and then after a certain point, sort of being kind of in my body and moving my body in a certain way, like I would just, it was too emotionally painful, I would just start crying. And I realized
you were probably exhausted as well. You weren't sleeping. You were suffering anxiety. There must have been a very deep-seated exhaustion as well, I would think.
Yes, because, you know, when I don't have the kids, I find myself, you know, I mean, part of it is kind of you know, sort of depression, like inability to get out of bed. So I'm sort of very high functioning some days, and other days I just can't do things. But I think when it was amazing when I started to approach the trauma recovery, it was very scary because I didn't want to go there. I really didn't want to go there, but I felt like I was ready. Like I felt like it had come to the top. And when I first moved out, although I was happy to move out, I still felt like, I describe it as like there was a fire alarm going off in my head the whole time. If you imagine what it's like when you're in a building and the fire alarm goes off and it's so invasive in your head, like there's no way you could possibly concentrate on anything. I felt like that all the time. And after the first trauma session we did, it didn't magically disappear, but it felt like it went down to a level where things
got
felt
a bit quieter.
Yes. And I think the thing is, because the abuse was so prolonged, and because it wasn't, you know, single events and it was very subtle, it's also really hard. And I think one of the things with psychological abuse is you don't really know what someone's done to you. Like, even if you know, oh, it's psychological abuse and he sort of did this and did that, even then it's really hard to kind of have a picture in your mind of exactly the things that were done.
Yes. And I can imagine it's a bit like finding a bruise and thinking, gosh, how did that, there's sort of, in psychological terms, you're still finding the bruises probably.
That's exactly it. So sometimes I will just, you know, so it's just things just come up and I'm like, oh, I've just realized this whole aspect of what happened. And I've realized that I'm still really carrying it around in a very sort of,
sometimes it's a feeling, isn't it? It's a feeling rather than an actual event.
So it was quite recently, it was just a sense of like, couldn't really identify the feeling first, but Hannah helped me identify it as disgust. And it was really about a sense of, like I said, even though I know that it's not the victim's fault and blah, 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 but somewhere in my body, I had a sense of sort of like self-betrayal, that I should have protected myself, I should have done more. And it had turned into this really visceral feeling of wanting to escape my body and wanting to get out and things like that. And I think I'd been carrying it around for a long time, but it just took me a while to identify it. And then we did some trauma work on it and it's really, really helped. And I think that's what it's like. It's sort of different things just start to come up when they're ready.
Layers, taking the layers off, isn't it?
Yeah.
Working.
So, you know, I was going to ask how long was the recovery process, but of course you're still going through it. But what level of recovery do you feel, if you can sort of put that into words at the moment?
I think it's really hard to say. I mean, apart from the fact that, you know, I'm still having to encounter there are certain abusive behaviours that I'm still encountering.
So what is the situation? You're still sharing the children?
Yeah, and I think the thing is that when you have like any form of abuse, is that, you know, any channel that exists between you know, the survivor and the abuser, is like any channel at all can and will be used as a channel of abuse. So you know, there's you know, whether it's a conversation that ought to be factual about the children then becomes something where what I've done or said gets twisted the wrong way and then used in some way against me, or whether social workers are being told things that aren't true, or the children being told things, you know, it sort of, it carries on. And, you know, there've been some surprises and some things which are sadly not that surprising anymore. And it's you know, it's you know, it's sadly an ongoing thing, because there's no reason why a person who thinks that's what I'm for would stop thinking that's what I'm for. So I just have to find a way to manage my recovery on the one side and getting back into life, while, you know, mitigating, you know, the effects of that. So it's you know, it's a journey. It's a journey that I'm on, and, you know, I've got to look after different things. You know.
And are you still seeing Hannah? Are you still having therapy?
Yeah, so I'm not seeing Hannah every week anymore, but, you know, I still come, and as I say, because I know that when things come up, you know, you know, we can go through some stuff, and I can get some extra tools, or, you know, sort of if I need another trauma session, then that's what I need to do. I would like to come off from best life circumstances, but there's no doubt that I think it's not only directly the tools that I learned and the things that we talked about, but while I was seeing Hannah, I was able to, I think, just because of the power that you get back for yourself, I remember realizing that I just stopped feeling scared of him. I mean, the things he was doing was scary, but I think I was able to kind of get him down to size, if you know what I mean, because another thing that abuse does, especially psychological abuse, is you feel that they've got more power than perhaps they actually do. And I was able to realize that, you know, he's not, and obviously that's an illusion that they want to create as well, that they know everything. And,
yes, it relates back to those three things you said at the beginning: the intermittent reinforcement, the gaslighting, and the uncertainty.
Yes.
If you agree with that, Emma, that's kind of what keeps you under the cosh.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy for somebody to, you know, withhold information or do things that kind of stymie various things you're supposed to be doing to keep you in a state of uncertainty. And so again, it's just a technique that I've had to learn. I mean, you know, you could say that dealing with uncertainty is a technique for dealing with life in general.
Yes.
But clearly when it's being specifically used to put me in a state of stress, that I have to find ways of kind of ring fencing that, to identify that this is what's going on, and to be able to kind of manage that.
And I think Emma's talked about, rather than her recovery, she's talked about rebuilding, because I think we covered in one session, we covered that there was a lot of loss and grief for the old Emma, and leaving that behind, and having to find this new person. So this rebuilding process has been important too, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely, I definitely feel that there are some things that just get lost in the fire, as it were. And
yes, so you haven't completely found the old Emma, but there's a new, stronger person has emerged from that fire.
Yeah, I think it's different. I mean, I think there's this kind of thing with survivors to say, you know, oh, it made you stronger and things like that. I think I was always, the way I think of it is that I was always strong, but somebody just taught me that I wasn't. And I've just regained what was always there. I've seen it.
I always saw Emma as a real lioness, you know, lioness with her cubs, with her children.
Oh, how lovely! Yes.
Yeah.
And but then, you know, other aspects of, you know, it changes your perspective on a lot of things. So, you know, things that I used to enjoy are not really that important to me anymore, but other things that weren't, you know, I've reached a new appreciation for things that maybe I didn't before. So it feels like you rebuild, and you rebuild slightly differently, and that's just who you are now, and that's just, you know, how it is, you know, that's just what it's like.
And how have your children been through all of this? Have they, I'm not sure how young they were, but have they had any inkling of what's been going on? Or
well, it's very difficult to say in some ways, because they were quite young when it first started becoming overt. And, you know, we had scenes with, like, you know, the children hiding under the table from scary sort of moments and displays and things. And, you know, so I've had, and my daughter was too young to really have a conversation about it, but with my son he did. And you know, I was more worried really with the kind of gaslighting side of things.
Yes.
On them, because if it took me years to get what was going on, their children. So I you know, they would repeat back to me sometimes things that they'd been told, and sometimes those things were very upsetting. And they separately have shown some signs of distress, and we're being sort of supported by CAMS and things like that, although that takes a long time, so we haven't actually been able to see anyone yet. But I think, you know, I did a lot of research on what I can do in this situation, and what I try and do is to get them to feel confident in themselves. So it's almost, Hannah's advised me on that as well, so it's almost like they start to appreciate their inner resources, and they start to be able to question for themselves,
recognizing their emotion and naming their emotions.
Also, like I kind of, the sort of joy shots and stuff. So one thing that used to happen in our home was that if I was playing, say, music that I liked in the kitchen and we were having a dance around, he might walk into the room and just switch it off. You know, I just consciously try and make sure that our home has music and has fun and has creativity, so that they can really feel free. And I've talked to them about you know, it's quite interesting because there's a lot going on at the moment, you know, with, like, you know, social justice issues and things like that, and that gives a really interesting sort of topical framework to talk about, you know, when people might want you to think someone else is, you know, a certain way, but, you know, we have to think for ourselves, and we have to, you know, decide for ourselves what we think is right, and, you know, that kind of thing. So I try and have really good conversations with them.
Yeah, Emma did a wonderful thing, and she had a sort of a list of what the children expected from the grown-ups.
Oh yeah. So I was like, what rules should the children have on what the grown-ups should do?
Yes.
You know, it was really funny, you know, it's like, put your phones down. But you know, they were saying other things as well, but I just try and model, you know, respect and listening to them, and, you know, while having boundaries. I think it's when I first left, I began to realize how it was difficult for me, and especially my son, who's quite strong-willed, is that I think we would both get really set off by any kind of form of conflict. It's just normal. So what would happen when I was trying to set a normal boundary is that he would then sort of rebel a bit, and then because of the loud noises and the feeling of tension, I would become very unsettled, and then he would become very unsettled, and it was like we both couldn't really handle that situation.
Yes. So again, your fight or flight was kicking off very quickly,
and probably his as well.
Hyper alert, yes.
Yeah, so it's sort of like we both, I feel like me leading him, because obviously he doesn't know what's going on, but I feel like we both had to travel hand in hand to a place where we can do all the things we're supposed to do, in a way that we both feel safe with.
Yeah. I could ask so many more questions to both of you, actually. I just wanted to ask you this. What advice would you give to anyone suffering from psychological abuse? And we could extend that to anyone who thinks someone they know is suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that if you already got to the point where you can identify it's psychological abuse, you've already come a very long way.
Yes.
Because most people suffering psychological abuse have no idea, because that's the nature of it.
Yeah.
I would say if you've got that far and you're like, I think he's gaslighting me, I think he's, or she or whoever is gaslighting me, then you've already come a really, really long way. And it's not easy, but the fact that you've got that far is, like, take courage. And there are a lot of really good resources online. There are a lot of really good books. there's a lady called Shannon Thomas who's written a book called Healing from Hidden Abuse, and it's a really great book that very humanely kind of walks you through what this is all about and how you can start to piece things together for yourself and all that sort of things. So and I would say just, you know, find a really good therapist. Yeah, find a good therapist. If you're in a situation of where there's a marriage and you're going to need a solicitor, you must find one who understands these things. If they don't understand this thing, you know, you must find one who gets it, because they will help you navigate the rest.
Right, yes. And Hannah, from what you said about the term coercive control sort of coming in, I can't remember quite, and was that in 2016?
15, yeah.
So 15. So why, in Emma's case, why wasn't that noted, and would it be now? By the authorities, I mean. Why, you know, why didn't that ever crop up?
I think there's a gap. I think because I went to the police, when I went to the police a couple of years ago, I think there's still a gap between what they didn't seem to know what could be used as evidence, and they told me that I didn't have any evidence, but I've since had advice that a lot of the things I was told weren't evidence, like, you know, my family seeing that my personality completely changed, and the fact that he accompanied me to doctor's appointments, and, you know, the fact that I was showing up at GP appointments with symptoms, like in the NICE guidelines to identify abuse, I was spot on. It's just that my GP didn't actually name it at the time, but it's all in my medical record. So I think I was told by the police, oh, well, you know, you don't have, like, because I don't have a broken arm or something, that oh, it's just not there. But I think I think it's just like all the kind of cogs in the system are still, you know, someone turning up to a police station and the right things happening is still a bit of an issue.
It's not all quite linked up yet.
No.
Yes,
and I think and I think also, you know, really it's and for me as well, that once I was in the divorce process, you can't go to Crown Prosecution Service and the family law and the family courts at the same time.
Right.
So once I was in that process, I couldn't really go to the police. They were like, even if we did have evidence, we couldn't do anything about it because you're in the family court system.
Gosh.
And the family court system depended on a social worker investigation that would confirm that this was actually abuse, and they weren't able to do that. The social worker, the way she described the behaviour describes abuse, but then she said, oh, well, I think he's just upset because of the breakup. So it was kind of, she kind of saw it, but she didn't see it. And then once she didn't see it, the family court was depending on that. So I basically, the way that the system is, I wasn't able to do that. But I really hope, that was a couple of years ago, and I really hope now that I would say, you know, go to victim support or Solace, run by Women's Aid, who help you navigate services, make sure that you're getting seen properly, and you know, I think it's all about getting the right support, because the frontline services, I think, can still be quite patchy in how they're dealing with people.
Mm. And Hannah, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I just think that all of us deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and, you know, breaking the chain of abuse has got to be our priority for the happiness of everyone involved, because I think even perpetrators of psychological abuse perhaps have also struggled with that somewhere along the line in order to have learnt this behaviour, possibly. I don't know the statistics around that, but that would be my sort of gut feeling about that. But it's so important that we do break this chain of abuse, because it obviously has repercussions for, you know, our little ones and the way that they behave as well.
Well,
absolutely.
I mean, because I decided to be more open about my experiences in my workplace, and my workplace is about 100 people, and when I told my story, over 10 separate people came up to me and said that they'd either grown up with abuse or had experienced it in a relationship. And so you can imagine the people who didn't come up to me. And, you know, that's just that's a normal kind of, that's just a normal professional office somewhere in London. And
yes, so really our best way forward is to raise awareness, because the police, all the professionals involved just need to know more about it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think they need to really get over that sort of stereotypes, because when you look at the nice, like the law is in the right place, the nice guidelines are in the right place, all this stuff, but I think that when you walk in the room, I still think there's a problem that people think a victim of domestic abuse or a perpetrator of domestic abuse behave in a certain way that they might not actually behave. And I think professionals themselves suffer from a kind of cognitive dissonance of not wanting to see it. None of us want abuse to exist. It's horrifying. And I think really people will kind of, people do not want to name the elephant in the room, and they don't even, they see it, but they don't see it. I've experienced this now so many times with different people. They're looking right at it and they're even describing it back to me, but they won't call it what it is. They'll attribute it to something else.
Yeah, name it as abusive behaviour.
Yeah. Keep naming it, keep raising awareness. Yes. Well, thank you so much for both talking so openly and extensively, but especially to you, Emma, for talking about your traumatic experience. And I'm so delighted to hear that you're telling your story to other people, and getting those reactions obviously is a good thing, really, that these people feel they can come up to you and speak. So thank you, Hannah and Emma, both of you, so much. Now, to listeners, if you or someone you know is experiencing psychological abuse, or abuse of any kind for that matter, and would like to speak to a Human Givens therapist, please visit our website. It's hgi.org.uk, and click on the Find a Therapist button, and you'll find your nearest therapist through that. We'll add this link on to the podcast page, together with a list of charities which might be able to help. And I think, as Emma mentioned, a few charities will pop those on. Now, please do share this podcast with your friends and colleagues, and certainly with anyone who you think might need to hear it. But generally, just to help raise awareness, as we've been saying, on psychological domestic abuse, what it is, and how it's going on. And we're putting this out specifically during our National 2019 Mental Health Awareness Week, but obviously it's not just for that week, it's something that can be listened to anytime. It'll be on our website anytime. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for speaking, Emma and Hannah, and we hope you all have a good day. Bye for now.